Hello, I'm Kelly Hurnett. Welcome to my presentation, Saving Native Bees. As Paige Emery so eloquently stated in her opening sentence of Our Native Bees, North America's Endangered Pollinators, and the Fight to Save Them, native bees are the poor stepchild of the bee world. Ask anyone in the United States to tell you about bees, and they will ultimately tell you about the honeybee, Apis mellifera. There are roughly 20,000 bee species around the world, and honeybees barely make up a mere fraction of that number. You might be wondering what the difference between a honeybee and a native bee is and why you should care. Did you know honeybees are not native to the Americas? They're native to Asia, Europe, and Africa. And unfortunately, they are now found everywhere except Antarctica. Sadly, the non-native honeybee was used in Honey Nut Cheerios' Save the Bee campaign, leaving the native bee population in serious danger. Honeybees gain the majority of attention, because they make honey. People believe they are the only bee that add value to the agricultural industry in which they are utilized as livestock, providing pollination service to farmers around the country, and the threat to bee farmers' livelihood due to colony collapse disorder. Yet most people don't realize their colonies are growing in numbers, not just in managed situations. Have you ever heard of a swarm of bees gathering around someone's property? Those are managed bees that have escaped their managed confines to create their own colony. They are considered feral bees, not wild bees. But how did the non-native species become the poster child for the Save the Bee campaign? Let's take a walk through history, shall we? During World War II, FDR imposed wartime sugar rationing, causing the government to encourage the production of honey as a substitute sweetener, and munitions plants began using beeswax to pack ammunition. Suddenly, beekeeping became an act of patriotism. In 1949, after the war ended and sugar was no longer rationed, honey sales plummeted. Shortly after, the honey subsidies was tagged into a massive new farm bill, a landmark piece of legislation that created the framework for the U.S. agricultural policy post-war era. The honey subsidy had been on the books ever since, until 1993, when Congress, under the Clinton administration, voted to ban all payments to honey producers that fiscal year. Later, in 1996, the honey program was officially eliminated with the passing of the 1996 Farm Bill. However, the George W. Bush administration reinstated the honey program with the passage of the Farm Security and Rural Investment Act of 2002, offering honey non-recourse marketing assistant loans and loan deficiency payment programs. In 2014, the USDA announced $8 million in Conservation Reserve Program incentives for Michigan, Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Wisconsin farmers and ranchers, where more than half of the commercially managed honeybees populations were kept during summer months, to establish new habitat for the declining bee populations. Looking locally, in 2018, according to the USDA National Agricultural Statistics Service, South Dakota beekeepers produced more than 7.8% of the U.S. honey crop, with an economic contribution of more than $23.7 million. Excuse me. In that same year, South Dakota lost 40% of its honeybee population, prompting the game fish and parks to implement pollinator plot on game production areas and in state parks across South Dakota. Fast forward to 2020, the honey from the 245,000 colonies in South Dakota brought in $23.9 million in revenue. They say money talks, so it is easy to see how the non-native honeybee with its well-known economic impact, along with America's love of honey, became the poster child for the Save the Bee campaign rather than our native bees. Unlike honeybees, who only work during ideal weather conditions and will visit any type of flowering plant that will allow them to collect pollen, our native bees, also known as wild bees, work hard in cooler and warmer temperatures and less ideal weather conditions. More notably, about 20 to 45% of native bees are considered specialists, meaning they only collect pollen from one species or genus of plant. While honeybees are considered social because they live in a colony, the U.S. only has one social bee, the bumblebee. 90% of native bees found in North America are solitary, meaning they do not nest with other members of their species and have special habitat needs for food, shelter, and reproduction. Not to mention, aside from the bumblebee, they are much smaller than the non-native honeybee and much more docile. You would really have to bother a native bee in order to get stung. Therefore, keeping native bees is much easier, less costly because you don't have all the fancy equipment to keep from getting stung, and less risky than keeping honeybees. Speaking of beekeeping, did you know the U.S. is the only country to keep, manage, and use non-native honeybees the way that we use them, as livestock for agricultural and economic gain? To manage bees means to deliberately raise and spread bee colonies. Managing something doesn't mean it can't be considered invasive. An invasive species is an organism that is not native to a particular area. Not all native species are invasive. To be invasive, a species must adapt to the new area with ease, reproduce quickly, and harm property, the economy, or the native plant and animals of the region. As stated previously, honeybees are an introduced species of bee that are managed as livestock to produce honey and provide pollination service in the agricultural industry. However, many people across the U.S. have started keeping the non-native honeybee as a hobby. This figure from Russo et al. 2021 shows that even managed introduced bees have a negative impact on native bees. For instance, an introduced or non-native managed social bee population will increase in size or reproduce with ease. Think a feral bee swarm, putting the native bee at risk or causing harm due to introduced pathogens and pests, as well as compete with local or native floral resources and therefore are considered highly invasive, meaning they will take over an area, pushing out our native bees. Managed honeybees are costly for beekeepers, oftentimes receiving special treatment because they are livestock, which includes veterinary care and feed during drought conditions. And although they are at risk for pests and disease, the number of colonies are worldwide are actually growing. According to Plant A's Bee Extinction, Why We're Saving the Wrong Bees, since 1961, managed hives have increased 83%. Honeybees are not at risk of extinction, but our native bees are. The way we use honeybees in the U.S. puts our native bees at very high risk for extinction. Native bee populations are declining at alarming rates. In fact, between 2006 and 2015, a study area showed 25% fewer species than in years prior to 1990. The numbers are declining due to several factors: competition from the non-native honeybee, disease and pests brought on by non-native insect species, as well as negative human impacts such as increased use of pesticides for all of those monocultured manicured lawns, anthropogenic caused climate change, and habitat change and fragmentation. All these caused by the increasing human population. There are 11 species of honeybees with Apis mellifera otherwise known as the Western honeybee or European honeybee, being the most common. Honeybees consume a lot of food, leaving little for our native bees. While honeybees are generalists, meaning they will consume nectar and pollen from plants, this causes two different issues for the native bee. They compete for the same floral resources as native bees, and it could put native ecosystems at risk by not allowing native pollinators to pollinate the flowers and plants they specialize in. And honeybees will pollinate non-native invasive plants that can outcompete our native plants and our native bees need for survival. They also compete for nesting cavities, which native bees need to reproduce. Competition for nesting cavities is not limited to native bees either. Honeybees can compete with birds and other small mammals that may be listed as near threatened or endangered, whose habitat and nesting areas are crucial to their survival. Unfortunately, because they are so widespread and were used as the poster child for the Save the Bee campaign, more and more people are participating in backyard beekeeping, which is perpetuating the problem for our native bees. Excuse me, the population of the United States has grown 46% since 1980. With increased population growth comes increased urbanization and ever-increasing habitat loss and fragmentation. Urbanization has a direct impact on biodiversity on smaller land scales due to pollination efficiency and bee diversity. It causes habitat loss, degradation, and fragmentation, as well as modification of soils and land use. Changes in water availability, changes in plant nutrient due to the introduction of non-native plants into landscaping, increased air pollution, introduction of impervious man-made structures such as buildings, parking lots, and sidewalks, and increased pesticide use and managed lawns are all related to urbanization. In a healthy ecosystem, most invertebrates serve important roles such as natural pest control, pollinating plants, and providing food and other wildlife. Very few invertebrates are actually pests. In fact, most species people consider pests are beneficial species. However, pesticides, such as but not limited to herbicides, fungicides, rodenticides, and insecticides, rarely distinguish between beneficial invertebrates and those which truly cause harm. These pesticides disrupt the natural systems that sustain us, not only posing risk to our native pollinators, but to humans and pets as well. Sadly, since pesticides are valued for their toxicity to these so-called pests, the risks they pose are overlooked, even when safer, more sustainable options are available. Every year, more than 1 billion pounds of pesticides are applied to land in the United States, with the majority being broad spectrum, meaning it will kill nearly everything it comes in contact with. Many pesticides have been banned in other states due to their extreme risk to humans. These include, but are not limited to, glyphosate, otherwise known as Roundup, which is available to the untrained public to purchase and use at their homes, neonicotinoids that are widely used in agricultural practices, which are very toxic to pollinators, beneficial insects, and aquatic invertebrates, and organosulfates, which were developed alongside the deadly nerve agent sarin during the Nazi regime. Another commonly used pesticide that harms pollinators and puts humans at risk is pyrethroids, which are used in mosquito management across the country. When human populations increase, so do burning of fossil fuels through factories, homes, and transportation, which contributes to the carbon emissions in our atmosphere, leading to anthropogenic climate change, which causes all different types of extreme weather, including drought. A recent study found after an area experienced drought, the number of native bee species, as well as the number of individual bees, declined, indicating that bee populations suffer losses during drought. while increased number of fires sweep through areas, burning off flowering plants in areas so great that native bees are unable to relocate and then die off. Some may think, well, who cares about native bees? If the non-native bees aren't going extinct, or honeybees can pollinate, so why should we care about native bees? Native bees have not been as well studied as honeybees. However, as we learn more, many scientists are concluding native bees provide more value to humans than honeybees in North America. Biodiversity is the variety of life. Without bees, we lack the diversity needed to sustain life on Earth. Bees provide biodiversity through pollination service, pollinating 80% of plants. All other living beings, including humans, depend on worldwide. A world without bees would look much different. Bees not only pollinate plants, they are a food source for other insects, birds, and wildlife that are indirectly impacted by pesticides when consumed via consumption of infected bees. The plants native bees pollinate provide habitat and food for insects, birds, and other wildlife as well. Birds and other wildlife help spread seeds from these plants and also contribute as food in the food chain hierarchy. It makes sense native bees that have evolved with native plants in North America would be better at promoting biodiversity in North America. But did you know native bees also have an impact on the food we eat? In some cases, pollinating plants the non-native honeybee can't. 1/3 of the human diet, about 70% of crops that provide 90% of the world's nutrition, require pollination. As mentioned, native bees are specialists, many to a specific genus of plants. For instance, the squash bee primarily feeds on pollen and nectar from squash, pumpkin, and other plants belonging to the gourd family. Just as our native bees are specialized servicing specific plants, many of our crops require certain bees to pollinate them, such as squash, tomatoes, blueberries, cranberries, and alfalfa, to name a few. Tomatoes can't be pollinated by honeybees because they require a special type of pollination called buzz pollination to dislodge the pollen from the anthers. Buzz pollination is provided by two native bee species, the bumblebee and the mud bee. Native bees are also far more efficient at providing pollination service. 1 hectare of apple trees would require tens of thousands of honeybees to pollinate them, but it only requires hundreds of Osmia cornuta, otherwise known as the orchard bee or mason bee. They are specialized to pollinate apple trees, hence the common name orchard bee. Many studies have shown crop visits by native bees produce many studies have shown crops visited by native bees produce larger fruit and higher crop yield. A study conducted by McInnes and Forrest in 2018 on strawberry crops showed that while the non-native honeybee and native bee both deposited the same amount of pollen per visited flower, strawberries that developed from visits of native bees only were heavier than flowers visited by honeybees. Moreover, flowers visited by both native bees and honeybees produced strawberries that weighed less than flowers visited only by native bees. Extinction of native bees and/or drastically declined populations would not only have serious impacts on food production, which would ultimately lead to human conflict, it would also have a detrimental impact on the United States economy. Native bees are vital to a range of wild and cultivated plants and crops, providing over $3 billion in pollination services and roughly 30% of food grown by the U.S. agricultural industry per year. Knowing how important native bees are to the survival on Earth through the biodiversity they provide, pollination services for food production, and aiding the U.S. economy, we must focus on how we can help protect native bees. Providing urban green space to combat habitat loss and habitat fragmentation is one way we as individuals, land managers, and city officials can help protect native bees. Pollination service by honeybees is predicted to decline with rising temperatures, while native bee pollination service is expected to increase. A study conducted by Olenek et al. Compared several factors to potential native bee losses, concluding habitat loss to have the largest negative impact on native bee abundance and diversity. This, coupled with the knowledge of how native bees contribute to increased crop production and larger fruit, one can see how understanding the impacts of habitat loss and fragmentation to native bees is important to not only ensuring stable, if not increasing food supplies, but also conservation of intact natural habitat in order to maintain resiliency and bee diversity. Agricultural systems and urban areas are highly fragmented, with home ranges limited by energy expenditures due to flying between nesting sites located in natural or semi-natural areas, and foraging ranges being a limiting factor. Closing the gap of this spatial fragmentation by providing buffers or edge habitat is needed in order to maintain human food security. Making sure these patches of habitat contain the required materials, especially as it pertains to nesting sites within the foraging range of each species, will be crucial to the success of native bee management. Understanding the habitat requirements of native bees is important to their survival and can help private landowners, homeowners, farmers, ranchers, city managers, public land managers, and private land managers incorporate these requirements into their management practices. Urban areas and edges along agricultural fields, especially those that meet wooded areas, provide crucial native bee habitat. Most adult native solitary bees only live 3 to 8 weeks, depending on sex and species. About 70% of native female bees nest in the ground, while 30% nest in cavities, such as hollow stems, rock crevices, or holes in trees. Only the female collects pollen and constructs a nest for her young, where she will create individual cocoons out of mud or leaves and put a pollen ball in each cocoon to feed her offspring. Male solitary bees have two functions: to eat and mate. They do not nest. They sleep on flower stems or under flower petals, therefore providing desirable plants is important. The lifespan of native solitary bees is about 1 year, with most of that time being in a cocoon during the developing stages from larva to pupa. The female will lay her egg in the growing season. That egg will remain in the cocoon and, depending on the species, will develop over winter or in the early spring to emerge the next growing season. This is why it is so important not to clean your garden in the fall, but wait until there is going to be at least a week of consecutive 55-degree Fahrenheit days with no returning cold snap before you clean your garden. Now, bumblebees are a little bit different. They are the only social bee native to North America. The queen bumblebee lives for 1 year, while workers live 2 to 6 weeks and males live 2 weeks. The queen is the creator and mother of her colony. Her lifespan begins in the late summer when she emerges from her cocoon to find food and shelter for winter hibernation, which she often finds in leaf litter. This is why it is so important to leave the leaves where they fall. Then, in the spring, she wakes to begin her search for a nesting site. Bumblebees nest in cavities, such as bird boxes, holes in the ground, under buildings, in tall grassy areas, in leaf litter, and rock piles. She will lay her eggs and guard them closely, sitting on them to keep them warm. The first round of eggs are generally comprised of workers who will quickly take to their duties so the queen can eat and continue to lay eggs. The last batch she lays will include the new queens and the males, who will then repeat the cycle of feeding, mating, hibernating, and laying eggs. Some bees, like the leafcutter bee, emerge later in the summer when temperatures are consistently 70 degrees Fahrenheit or warmer. Because different bee species emerge at different times throughout the growing season, it is important to provide at least 90% native, non-cultivated plants, trees, and shrubs that bloom throughout the entire growing season. Though some people claim 100% native is the only way to go, later we will see how allowing some non-native plants in smaller areas may actually help native bees. When selecting native plants, be sure to use their scientific name rather than the common name. Many cultivated plants, otherwise known as genetically modified plants, tend to go by the same common name. However, these plants have been specifically raised for certain traits, and oftentimes they don't produce the quality nor the quantity of pollen and nectar of a truly native plant. It is important to be mindful when buying plants from box stores and nurseries that don't grow their own native plants. It is important to be mindful when buying plants from box stores and nurseries that don't grow their own plants. Oftentimes, the growers treat the plants with pesticides to keep the plants looking healthy for their trip from the grower to the nursery sales floor. Long-term land management specific for native bee habitat can not only increase the number of species present, but also allow for species that had been thought extinct to return to sites. A study conducted in Cleveland, Ohio, in 2021 that looked at 40 different vacant lots that had been assigned one of 5 habitat treatments showed native bee abundance to be greater in patches of land that were 15 acres and larger that were planted with a native wildflower seed mix or fine fescue grass. Although the plants selected may have been more of a contributing factor than the size of the lot. Native bees don't always eat in the same location they nest. Native bees are often observed pollinating agricultural crops. However, their nesting sites, while still within foraging range, are often in different locations. Several studies have shown having natural edges along agricultural areas increase pollination service from native bees as well as bee diversity. With nesting site proximity to foraging range, likely the most limiting factor in native bee survivability, it is important to understand the foraging ranges of native bees. Native bee usage of crop fields was higher when natural edge habitat that provided nesting sites were within 1 to 2.5 kilometers of crop fields. Location of nesting sites also translates into urban green spaces such as parks and gardens. A study conducted in 2002 showed foraging ranges were different for different species and also dependent upon the size of the bee. Between the 16 bee species surveyed, they showed a preferred range between 150 and 600 meter radius, suggesting the Cleveland, Ohio study indicating 5 hectares was needed may not be necessary if all of the other habitat requirements are met. while another study indicated that smaller urban areas such as parks, gardens, and residential yards are utilized as connectivity habitat, serving as corridors between larger habitat areas. When considering small areas, in 2002, a study showed it is important to try to keep fragmentation and disturbances to green areas at no more than an intermediate level because no disturbances created more competition, leading to less species richness, whereas intermediate disturbance, which allowed non-native plants to thrive, brought higher species richness by allowing less competition, while high disturbances caused species richness to decline below the levels of non-disturbed areas. As we can see, native bees have rather special requirements depending on whether they are on the edges of agricultural land or in urban settings. Knowing the differences and creating conservation practices to meet those requirements will prove beneficial to saving native bees. Whether you're a farmer, rancher, or live in town, you can take action to help save native bees by becoming a native beekeeper rather than a honey beekeeper, providing native plants and nesting habitat on your property, managing your garden to accommodate the emergence schedules of native bees, reducing or stopping the use of pesticides, and encouraging your neighbors and city officials to do the same in natural areas in and around the town you live. Thank you for allowing me to share my passion about native bees with you today. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.